Chapter 7 will deal much more with terminology than it will with graphs. We'll add some graphs later on, but for Chapter 7, mainly we're just dealing with ideas and some terminology, but some broad stuff. A lot of it you have heard before, so that's good. You should have a pretty good starting knowledge. Let's look at a couple of the ideas. The first thing we'll do is go over several market structures, things like monopolies, oligopolies, things like that. Second section goes over market failures, that if things aren't done right in a market economy, that the whole system can fail, like in 2008 or Great Depression, stuff like that. And then the third section we'll go over the government's role in trying to prevent bad things from happening. Just before we get into that section 1, right there at the beginning on page 163, your book uses once again that awesome, fantastic, wonderful term, laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, your book says, means allow them to do. I remember my conversations with Mr. Bouton back in the day when I used to ask him about this. He said one of the reasons that he ended up moving to America was because of laissez-faire. And in France, they weren't practicing that very well. Government was getting too involved. In America, mainly, at least used to, they leave people and companies alone to run their own life. So he's a big fan. I like that because that's a French word, and he could say it so beautifully, much better than most of us can say it. We go back to Adam Smith's writings for this one. Smith, in his book, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith came up with this idea to teach people that markets are better off if they are left alone. At least according to him and according to, at least as a conservative economic thought. And now regarding that laissez-faire, so much of what we look at in this chapter is going to be looking at how much competition is allowed to flow inside of a market. For instance, let's take this idea of perfect competition, and we'll talk about it in just a second. In perfect competition, you have a lot of competitors, a lot of companies competing against each other, whereas in monopoly, you only have one company, so there's not a whole lot of competition. However, in a monopoly, you'll have total control of the market because there are no competitors. But in perfect competition, because you have so many competitors, you have less control of the market. So all four of these market structures are dealing with how much competition there is, how much control of the market there is, and we're going to go from the largest number of competitors, starting with the perfect competition, the most competitors, and we'll go through the system until we get to monopoly where there's only one. All right, so let's start with perfect competition. Once again, just before we get into the definition of it, I want to make sure that we understand one term, and this term isn't used, or this idea is not talked about until you get into the monopoly section on page 169. In fact, it doesn't use the term until page 171 underneath the section that talks about monopoly and profit maximization. But a big part of what we're talking about inside of these four market structures is the idea that as a perfect competition, in perfect competition, each company is a price taker because they don't get to make their own prices. The market makes the prices, and remember your equilibrium graph. Right? So in the market tells the company, this is the price that you charge, period. You don't get to choose your own price. Whereas in the opposite, a monopoly is a price maker. They just make whatever price they want to. And it's one of the reasons people fear monopolies is because they fear that monopolies are just going to raise prices because there's no competition. And indeed they could, because they're the only price maker. With the other two that we look at, with monopolistic competition and oligopolies, it's somewhere in between these two things. But just wanted to go over those ideas and make sure that we understand that there are price makers and there are price takers. In perfect competition, each company is a price taker. they don't really get a whole lot of say at all in the price, because if they move their price, especially up, they're going to lose all competition, but they can't really move it down either because of the market conditions. So there's 5 conditions, 5 things that your book goes over that makes up a perfectly competitive market. Note, there are very, very few of these in the world. Hardly anything really fits this example of a perfectly competitive market. The closest thing you'll come is probably some agricultural markets. Airlines are sometimes used as an example, but there are no real perfect examples of this. It's more of an idea. So first thing, you have to have a large number of buyers and sellers. You've got to have a lot of companies, even hundreds and hundreds of companies that are selling identical products. And think agriculture. I mean, even though you have organic nowadays and non-organic, and you have sometimes the apples are larger than another company's apples, nonetheless, you're still selling an identical product. You're just kind of changing it around a little bit. So it's so hard to find identical products, but this is what the idea is. So if you had a large number of buyers and sellers, identical products, independent buyers and sellers, independent meaning that there's no outside control of them. So the buyers are competing against each other to get the products. The sellers are competing against each other, and there's no outside influence telling them what to do or where to go. It's all happening independently of any outside control. The fourth thing is you have to have good information. You have to be able to look up information about the companies, look up information about the products. And the consumers have to have good information so they can make good choices. And then lastly, easy and free entry into the market. So, and this isn't so much of a buyer issue as it is a seller issue. That if another company wants to start up a company to enter this market and compete, they can. There are no rules against it or laws against it. There are no companies that are able to keep them out of doing so. So because of this, you end up having a whole lot of sellers selling exactly the same product with no outside influences. Everybody has good information and easy and free entry into the market. And if you have that, you have perfect competition. You have the best, most complete competitive companies that you're going to have. Prices will stay low. Hopefully quality will stay high. But like I said, that doesn't exist very much. Most of the time what you'll see is what we call monopolistic competition, which will be next. Now, let's take a look at this graph. Don't worry about it. You don't have to reproduce this one, but I did want to show it to you just so we can understand. In perfect competition, your graph will look similar to this. The industry is the price maker. The company is a price taker because they don't get to make their own price. The industry tells them what to do. So you got your demand curve, your supply curve. Here's your price right here, equilibrium price. So you carry that over. This is the market right here. You carry this price over to the firm, and you notice you got your marginal revenue here. Don't worry about the AR. That just means average revenue. It's going to be the same thing. But on this graph, it's just showing you that the market makes the price and then carries that price right over to the firm. And then you'll notice the firm, and this is your profit maximizing quantity of output graph, and here's your profit maximization. And later on, we'll go over why the average total cost is here. But this is just to illustrate the idea that in perfect competition, the companies are not price makers. It is the industry that makes the price and then carries that price over to the company. Now, looking at monopolistic competition, there are a lot of similarities. You'll read over those in your text. There are some similarities to perfect competition, but the biggest thing that makes monopolistic competition different from perfect competition is product differentiation. What you're trying to do in monopolistic competition is to differentiate your product from everybody else's product. So take these companies right here, good example of monopolistic. They have very, very similar products, right? You got your burgers, you got fries, You got your drinks and stuff. You got regular, but these companies always try to do something different. Burger King, for a while, tried to do have it your way, right? At Burger King, you can order a burger and tell them how to make it. It's not just pre-made, right? With like Whataburger, it's just pure awesomeness, and they got spicy ketchup, right? So they all got these little tiny things. Jack in the Box was the first one to stay open 24 hours, and they tried to differentiate themselves and say, if you need a late night snack, here you go, come into here, right? So the differentiation just means taking some kind of an edge from the other companies. Your book puts it at the bottom of the definition of monopolistic. It says that you're trying to monopolize, and this is why you call it monopolistic competition. You try to monopolize a small portion of the market. So McDonald's is the biggest one here, but McDonald's is not going to sell all of the burgers and fries in the world. It's probably a good thing we don't die. But they're the biggest one here, so they know they're not going to sell everything, but they might just try to get really, really, really big and sell more. In-N-Out Burger, those are pretty good burgers, but they're not as widespread. So they're not trying to maybe sell 1 billion burgers a year. They're just trying to take one little piece of the market and get some like loyal customers that only buy their burgers, right? That's what monopolistic competition is. It's kind of the same thing as perfect competition, except different products. Now the term non-price competition comes up because these companies have such similar products, they're simply differentiated, that they don't really deal with a lot of price competition. I mean, it's a little bit. In-N-Out and I guess Wendy's might have a little bit more, but pretty much burgers are the same price across the board. Maybe an average of $4 for a burger across the board. Depends on how what burger you get and how big it is and such. But for the most part, they have similar prices. You don't have one of them charging $8 for a large fry. Okay, you have to go to Five Guys to get that. These guys kind of have all regular, normal, average prices among them, all kind of the same. So what they do is they compete with things other than price. They compete with quality. Maybe they compete with geography. They try to get as many stores as they can around you so that they're always nearby, McDonald's. They try to compete in Texas with Whataburger, saying that it's like the Texas thing. You try to compete with staying open late, right? So you find these other ways of competing besides just using your price. And this is done, of course, anywhere, but monopolistic, this is kind of a key for it, because you can't really change your price a whole lot. You can't change it at all with perfect competition, but in monopolistic, you can't really change your price a whole lot because the competition has kind of kept it in this certain range. So think about those things when you think of monopolistic competition. Your book calls an oligopoly a market structure where there's a few large companies that are kind of dominating the industry, right? There's a few. So you have competition, but not a lot of competition, right? Think of cell phones is a good one. Airlines, car manufacturers. There's competition there, but the competition is somewhat limited because there's only a few large ones that are controlling the market. There might be some smaller ones, but they don't have hardly any say, or the big guys just swallow them up or drive them out of business, leaving just the small group to sell. Now, there are a few special terms underneath an oligopoly to recall. First of all, the oligopolies are interdependent. Interdependent means they're not independent of each other. They don't work alone. They work together. Now, it's not especially illegal to kind of work together on things. It's only illegal, and we'll get into the illegal things in a second. But to be interdependent means that you do kind of pay attention to what all the other companies are doing. You are kind of careful to not make a big move. I mean, let's say if one of these phone companies, let's say AT&T, decides just to drive their price down, and they want more of the market, so they have a big giant sale and they have very, very low prices. Well, the other companies will be probably encouraged to drop their prices. And that sounds good for me and you, but what's going to happen is that all four of them are now acting, again, interdependently, because one company does it, they all do it. And then what happens is they all lose profit, and then they all start to slowly raise their prices again. But the companies could be hurt with these kind of price wars, and your book talks about price wars between these large companies like this. Now, there are some illegal ways of being interdependent as well, and that's mainly with collusion and price fixing. Price fixing is an example of collusion. The idea behind collusion is that companies will get together and they will agree with each other to kind of limit competition. Instead of competing with each other, let's all charge the same price, or let's all make sure we restrict production of this specific item so that the price stays high, because if the supply is low, the price will be high. Think OPEC, the group of nations over in the Middle East that produce a lot of oil, and they control the price of oil more than anybody else. So every once in a while they get together and they produce a lot of oil, which drives the price down, or they'll produce very little oil, which drives the price up. So that's collusion. Well, if you do that in America, you're breaking the law. If a group of companies, if all these companies right here got together and said, look, if we all just jack up our prices, if we all double our prices, people have to have their cell phones nowadays, so let's all double our prices, and if everybody does it together, we make a bunch of money. Well, if they did that, if they colluded to do something like that, they would get in trouble. I hope they would get in trouble. I hope they would get caught. It'd be pretty obvious. So that's against the law. It's against the law to specifically reduce competition just to make a profit. Now, because of this pricing problem, the fact that if one company drops their price, all of them have to drop their price, and then they're all losing profit. Because of that, these companies, these oligopolies, also tend to use that non-price competition. They all tend to find different ways. We give you unlimited data. With us, turning in your old phone, you'll get a brand new phone with us. So they all have their different ways of competing that don't have to deal with prices. The main reason for this is that it's easy for your competitor. Let's say AT&T drops their prices, and then the other three drop their prices. They could do that in just a day or two. So it's easy to compete with each other with price, but it's very difficult to compete with each other in other areas. Let's say Verizon figures out some way to have a phone installed in your brain when you're born, and you don't ever need to have a phone. I know, kind of whacked out. It's late, and I have a headache. So if they were to figure out that, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile would be in a lot of trouble, because they wouldn't be able to replicate that kind of technology for a long time. So Verizon would have a big time head start, and they would get a whole lot of people to buy their products, to buy their service, because they were able to compete in this new way. So if you compete with price, everybody can follow you. But if you compete with other things, quality, new items, this non-price competition, if you do that, then it's hard to follow. All right, last one then. Now let's talk about monopolies. I think probably when people hear about monopolies, they think about either this, the big king knocking over the little tiny pawns, or perhaps this. Maybe that's what you think of in monopolies. In the end, most monopolies are not monopolies that just is one company driving everybody out of business. That's kind of what you learn in American history when you go over those robber barons, and you go over that time period where they were driving other companies out of business a lot of the time. Those are great stories, but they don't really happen a lot, especially nowadays with all the trust busting stuff we'll look at in section 3. But there are 4 types of monopolies to look at. 4 types of, and they're pretty simple to understand. Your geographic monopoly makes sense because you're the only store in the area. And it doesn't make any sense to have 2 Walmarts in a town of 10,000 people. So, you get to be the only seller of low-priced junk that Walmart might sell. We don't need two gas stations in the middle on a highway in the middle of nowhere, so you just have one gas station, so a geographic monopoly, and that makes sense and that's easy. The second one being a technological monopoly, because you created something that technologically advances you past your competition. Now, a couple of notes on this on page 170 on the technological monopoly. Your book does remind you that most technological monopolies are going to be formed around a patent. You invent some new kind of way of doing something or a new product, and then you patent that product. That patent will last for 20 years. And then your book even mentions copyrights, which last 50 years plus your lifetime. Just kind of take note of those. Those are always good. That's always good information to have. But if you have a new technology that comes out, makes you better off, and you're able to enjoy that for at least 20 years, or until somebody copies it and doesn't get in trouble for it. Third one is a government monopoly. Your slide here mentions things like education, electricity, and such. It makes some sense. I'm not saying it's always a good thing, but it does make some sense, because imagine if there were 10 companies that wanted to sell electricity to Sugar Land. You could have 10 sets of power lines coming into Sugar Land. Well, that would make Sugar Land pretty ugly. Now, they get around that, of course, because what they do is that one company builds the power lines, and everybody else who wants to sell electricity has to pay rent to use their power lines. It's kind of a weird system, but there are ways around it. But the government monopoly is when the government allows certain things to be done, or it does it by itself. It creates it by itself. Water use. Local governments have a monopoly over the water system and the sewer systems. Military. Your book mentions the military. Obviously, that's a government thing. Now, they pay companies to be a part of that, but the government's the one that controls that and pays out the money for that. And then the fourth one is a natural monopolies. The slide here isn't very specific, just when the monopolies happen naturally. I like your book definition better. A market situation where the costs of production are minimized by having a single firm produce the product. In other words, it's just better. Now, I'm going to make the argument that this is a pretty innocent form of monopoly. It's not driving somebody out of business. It's not forcing them. But if you can make a product better, higher quality, lower price, and you drive somebody out of business because you're just better than them, I don't really think that's illegal. If you collude or if you do some pretty underhanded things, okay. But this seems, natural monopolies, if they happen naturally without breaking the law, I can't call them bad, because it's just those things are happening. And monopolies in history, they don't typically end up with really, really high prices, because if you have a monopoly and then you jack up the price, you lose most of your customers. So monopolies tend to not do that. Think Walmart. In some towns, Walmart has the only hardware store or the only place to buy some of the specific goods for, like working on your lawn or something like that. They don't jack up the prices because they're the only one in town. Part of the reason that happens is what you call economies. Economies of scale. Economies of scale tells you that the bigger you are, the lower your production cost can fall. Now, this is a very, very important term. So important that I wrote it very poorly on the slide here. Sorry, but economies of scale is an important one to understand why monopolies don't always have these outrageously high prices. Because the bigger a company gets, think if you go to Sam's Club and you buy, the cereal in like 2 or 3 boxes at a time, and then they package it and wrap, they give you a price break for doing that, right? So if you go to Walmart right next door in Sugar Land, if you go to Walmart, you might pay $4 for a box, but if you go to Sam's and buy 3 boxes, they give you a price break because you're buying more. They give you a little bit of a discount. So you buy 3 at once, you might only pay $3 per box. So then that's kind of what's happening here with economies of scale, that as these monopolies get bigger and bigger and bigger, they buy more stuff, they buy more goods, they buy more resources, and so they get these price breaks when they're buying resources. So when they produce their goods, their cost of inputs is lower, and therefore they're able to lower their price. So a lot of times, these monopolies, because of this economies of scale idea, monopolies are able to have low prices instead of having these really, really high prices. All right, last note on monopolies is the idea that most of the time we don't have a lot of monopolies like these. These are still pretty rare. Americans, your book even mentions on page 169, last paragraph, that Americans don't really like monopolies. We don't really like it. We like competition, and we even root for the small guy. So Americans really don't like them very much, and our government has outlawed them, so you don't have a whole lot of monopolies. Most of them are called, and right above that last paragraph on page 169, your book calls them near monopolies. Most of the monopolies that we face are near or close to monopolies. It's kind of a technological monopoly, but there's somebody else that has kind of sort of the same kind of product, but not exactly the same as ours. Think Apple. When Apple comes out with a brand new cool thing, everybody wants to buy Apple. Well, a couple months later, Samsung comes up with something close to it. So while Apple may have a monopoly on this new cool item, Samsung has something else that is kind of sort of close. So it's a near monopoly of this particular item. So that's more of what we have are near monopolies rather than actual monopolies. With all that talk about markets and such, there are certain times when markets fail. And again, I remind you of things like 2008 with the big giant housing crisis when all the houses fell in price and foreclosures and bankruptcies and banks lost money and investment firms lost money. And we experienced the largest recession and the largest economic downfall since the 1930s and the Great Depression. So that's an example of when the market kind of fails. And there were a ton of reasons why 2008 happened. Everybody wants to blame somebody else. There's probably not enough blame to go around for all that needed it. But your book does a pretty good job here of giving some examples about why things happen. So as we go through these markets, the market failure ideas, I do want to kind of connect into 2008 a little bit and talk about perhaps why that happened. The first one that could happen is inadequate competition. There's not enough competition in the market. There's a couple things underneath inadequate competition. The resource allocation, if businesses don't use their resources well, or if they don't care about the prices, so they pay ridiculously high prices for stuff without thinking about how that drives up their costs. Another one, the high prices, that's a big one with the housing crisis because house prices in many areas were skyrocketing, but there was no real reason for it. So you had people having to pay $500,000 for a home that really was only worth maybe $200,000 because of these high prices. And then reduced output, they weren't producing a whole lot, so the supply was down, so that drove up prices even higher. And when that whole thing came crashing down, those home prices came down with it, and people lost a lot of money in a lot of homes. The economic and political power, we'll get into that a little bit in a couple minutes. Inadequate information is another problem that is faced. Inadequate information. There's not good information coming up about what's happening, about what real values are for like prices. Your book talks about wages, how wages can be different in different industries, and how that may make people leave certain jobs or quit certain jobs, and one industry might not get good workers because their wages aren't high enough. And anyway, if there's not good information about what's happening in the market, markets are not very strong. Another one is the resource immobility. Your book uses labor to explain this, and I think that's a pretty good one. If a large company like Schlumberger, right next door to our school, if Schlumberger goes out of business, you're going to have thousands of people lose their jobs. Some of them will go elsewhere, but some of them won't. And the ones that don't, they may have to move, but people don't really like to move. So you have this labor resource that just kind of sits here not being used. You have the same kind of thing can happen with any other resource if it's used inefficiently. You may have one company buys up an enormous amount of one particular resource so that other companies can't get that resource, and the company that buys it doesn't use it. It just kind of sits there. So resource immobility, it doesn't get used well, they don't get spread out. That could be a problem. Externalities, this is a good term for you to use in economics quite a bit. An externality, your book calls it an unintended side effect of some kind of an action. That unintended side effect can either help or harm. Usually when you talk about externalities, you're talking about negative externalities. That you made some decision and it might have been good for one area, but other areas were harmed. And your book has a picture there of one of the larger airplanes going behind some houses. Well, making a decision to expand an airport is good, but now your home prices in that area are going to plummet because of all the noise, all the problems that are going to come with all of the noise. So negative externalities are a common deal, and markets can fail if externalities are too much for the market to handle. Your book does mention positive externalities, a benefit received by someone that has nothing to do with the activity. These aren't really talked about or worried about very much. Mainly it's the negative ones that people worry about. And the last idea that can make markets fail would be the public goods. Public goods are ones that everybody consumes. We went over this last semester in government class as well. The market, however, doesn't always provide these public goods, at least according to your book and according to some economists, that if a market, without the help of the government, if a market is left on its own, it's not going to provide education. It might not provide interstate highways. I personally would disagree, because before the government did these things, we did them on our own. We did do these things. We did have an education system in every state, and we did have highways that went interstate and even national, coast to coast. The government took over that job, so we don't do it anymore. Anyway, on the bottom paragraph of that section on page 176, your book does say that the market economy is very successful in satisfying individual wants and needs. That the market looks out for me and you, because if I want something, I save up for it and I buy it, or I go get a job and I buy it, and companies are very good at supplying products that I want. So a market economy does very good at watching out for the individual, but the market economy doesn't do very good at watching out for the collective needs. The collective doesn't matter as much to a market economy. All right, last section, section number 3, role of government. Depending on who you are, this also may be a good picture to explain the role of government in an economy. Forgive me, I am a conservative at heart, so this is the way I look at the government looking at me and you. Wondering, how can I dominate this person? How can I take away their money, blah, blah, blah. That's not fair, and that's not actually very accurate. Most of the time our government is looking out for us. Most of the time our government wants to do good for us. It might or might not, its actions might or might not do good, but there are a couple of things that the government does in aiming to try to help. An example of those ones is Sherman Antitrust Act. The main purpose of that act was to make sure that competition flows freely, make sure that the big companies aren't squashing competition. This is in the 1890s, leading up to Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century, and Teddy Roosevelt and all the things he did to try to crush these trusts or these monopolists, these kind of monopolies and stuff that existed back then. That's kind of some of the things that he tried to do. You've got Federal Trade Commission formed, so that'd be 1914, and they were formed in order to try to make sure companies are not doing illegal actions to limit competition. In particular, price discrimination was a big one, where they charge one price to one customer, another price to another customer, maybe in a different area or a different county or a different state. They're changing prices for no good reason, just discriminating using price. So the Federal Trade Commission would use things like cease and desist orders to order a company to stop acting in a certain way. Now you might look at that and call that good, and certainly I don't mind the idea. I do wish it wasn't a government regulation to do that one, simply because it has given the government more and more power since then. But, I mean, these things do have at their heart the idea that we're going to do good things to help out people. They are trying to aim at helping out individuals, helping out groups and cities and stuff against unfair business practices. All right, as you read through the rest of the chapter, and do read it, it'll help you with the understanding. I do want to make sure that a couple of other government entities are talked about. The SEC, in particular, the SEC dealing with trading, especially stocks, but they watch over other things as well. But, the stocks and the corporations that we looked at in Chapter 3, the selling of stocks and, we're not breaking all the rules that deal with selling stocks. And the SEC was established to make sure that all of that runs smoothly, really to help keep us away from another Great Depression. That's what their kind of job is. And then you have another one called the FDIC. FDIC is a corporation created during the Great Depression era in order to make sure that banks don't go, if you will, bankrupt. They don't go bankrupt or run out of money. If they do, and they don't have any money, and people come up there and demand their money, the government can help them out. If a bank doesn't have any money left, if you put your money into a bank, let's say you put $100,000 into a bank, and that bank goes bankrupt, they don't have any more money, you just lost $100,000. So you might be afraid to put your money in banks. Well, if you don't put your money in a bank, people can't use your money to go buy a house or go to college, and the bank can't loan out your money to other people if people don't put any money into the bank. That's kind of how it works, right? So you put your money into the bank, and the bank loans your money out to somebody else who goes and buys a car or goes to college or buys a house. So the bank loans it out to them, and then they pay money back to the bank, and then your bank can pay you back, and the bank keeps the difference. The bank keeps the interest on that. So banks can make money doing that. You can make an interest rate doing that. Other people get to buy cars and houses if they want to. But if nobody puts money into the bank, then the bank has no money for that, and that's not good for the economy, to keep the economy growing and rolling. So if people are afraid to put their money into a bank because they're going to lose it, the FDIC comes in to rescue us all, and the FDIC insures that money up to, there's a number, $250,000 per bank. So I can put in $250,000 in a bank, and if that bank just kind of blows up and all my money is gone, which that's not actually accurate, but you get the idea. If all my money is gone, or somebody robs a bank or whatever, I didn't lose all my money, because the government will insure my money. They will give my money back to me if that happens. All right? So those are some other government entities that exist. And that concludes this particular podcast. And look at that. We beat the time. It's under 40 minutes. Woo! All right. God bless. And we'll see you guys in class.